Welcome to Always Listening. We are your hosts. I'm Joel.
I'm Jay, and I am the new female Thor. Wait, that doesn't work. But I did have a lightning strike literally right next to me yesterday, and there was another lightning strike at the world-famous Choate Rosemary Hall boarding school, which is here in town and just a couple blocks over from me. Lightning struck the building, caught fire. It was big news, because it's just a couple blocks away.
Well, I'm glad you're okay.
Yeah,
Jay. I'm glad you made it through the storm. As
I'm
were.
Thor.
I am now familiar with Night Monkey.
Yes.
I saw the Spider-Man film, so I'm all good there, folks. It was good. If you haven't seen it, get out to theaters and see that one as well. We're not going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about podcasts, Jay.
Woo!
Why don't we start with what Apple is doing? First of all, they're doing a couple of things this week, as a matter of fact. The new Apple categories are going into effect in the back end of many of your media hosting providers. We'll talk about that more in just a second. But right after you and I got done recording last week, it's one of the problems you mentioned of recording early. We missed a Nick Qua report in the Hot Pod newsletter. This is from Bloomberg. Apple is planning on spending some money, Jay.
Yes, and this is actually not even the article that we missed last week from recording early. This is a little bit more recent, but Bloomberg put out a report that says that Apple has been reaching out to independent podcasters looking to acquire them and make them exclusive to Apple. Now, I don't 100% know why Apple would be doing this, what the long game is for them in terms of this, other than they see Spotify doing it and maybe even Pandora doing this a little bit, and there's that sort of competition. But Nick Qua in today's Hot Pod said this: assuming the Bloomberg report holds true, Apple is now another major buyer, and that's good news for a certain, I'm pausing there for dramatic effect, kind of audio producer, creator, and entrepreneur. And now let me go back to that pause. For a certain kind of audio producer, creator, and entrepreneur. Now, Todd Cochran on the New Media Show also mentions, he's mentioned this numerous times, he mentioned it this past weekend, Apple can do a rounding error in their accounting and buy the top 200 podcasts and not even a blink of an eye, and now they'd put a major dent in Spotify's distribution plans, because if Apple had all of the top 200 shows, now is it in those top 200 shows to be only exclusive to Apple? Probably not. I think that's what's getting lost in the messaging here with everyone's reactions, is that why would being exclusive be in the best interest of any program unless the check being made out to you to be exclusive was a ginormous one? And I mean, it would have to be ginormous, because you have to think about the long-term revenue that you're going to be missing out on when you're talking about the loss of revenue from being exclusive to just one platform.
Yes, and yet, here we are as an industry out here every day. What do we promote first and foremost, and have since the very beginning?
Apple.
Subscribe in Apple Podcasts. Review us in Apple Podcasts. Drop that review in iTunes. Don't you know it helps other people find us? It's so helpful for new listeners to discover our show. It's not, by the way, it's not helpful for new listeners to discover our show. We've talked about that. But we say that. We give them the promotion for free anyway, Jay. I'm saying we've given them the promotion for 10 years. Longer than that. How long has it? We've been in the Apple, in the
14,
iTunes
15 years.
Yeah, 14 years now. Yeah, a decade and a half. Like, I'm glad they're writing a check. I'm not going to complain about this at all. And I think that many of the podcasts that are going to be targeted won't have any problem being Apple exclusive anyway. I bet when they look at their stats, many of them are 70-80% Apple currently. They'll be happy to direct the rest of that audience either to their website, where they can just click play and listen to it through Apple's player that now works on the web, or go straight to the Apple Podcasts app. that now also works on your Mac, you know? So like, I think the combination of those things, that Apple is pushing the Apple Podcast brand a little bit more and separating the app out onto Mac as well, and the fact that the shows that are going to be targeted and the kind of producers, as Nick said, that certain kind, their listeners are not listening in Overcast primarily anyway. Their listeners are not listening in Spotify primarily anyway. Now, those shows over the next 5 years could easily drive a lot of listeners to Spotify if they started promoting it heavily. And I think that's what Apple is trying to head off here.
Perhaps, but again, it's sort of... We've had this conversation, and specifically we had it around when Spotify started purchasing shows and making them exclusive to Spotify, and sort of the whole idea of there's going to be these closed platforms. I do get concerned, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the article about what will kill podcasting. I am a little concerned about this closed platform thing, and it's not that I'm one of those old fogies that is like, oh, open source, RSS, blah, 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 blah. I'm more about which platform's going to work best for my little show that doesn't drive enormous listens? Which platform's going to embrace me? Which platform is going to be like, hey, we need you on our site just as much as we need this ginormous one that, you know, commands millions of downloads per episode? Which platform is going to work best for me? And at this particular point, I don't think any of the distributing platforms have that in mind at all. If Apple, the only one that we thought previously was Apple, but if Apple's now getting into this game of exclusivity, that changes their whole, you know, that's going to change everything for them. They're going to be more inclined to promote the shows that are exclusively on Apple that they've paid for. It's just, that's how business works. So now what happens to the independent podcasters? That's what I get. That's where my concern lies, and we can only wait and see. And most of these platforms still remain open and yet have exclusive content as well. But at the end of the day, we know what's ultimately going to happen as the years go by. They're going to close their walls and they're going to shut out the little voices because all they're doing is, you know, taking pennies away from their riches.
I'm just not worried about that. I'm just not. You know, I know that there are people out there like Marco Arment with Overcast. There are other third-party app developers, some smaller, some larger, that are heavily into the idea of independent podcasters. There are people like Todd Cochran. There are people like Rob Walsh. And those folks are going to be able to maintain an independent ecosystem no matter what the big dogs do. That's the way that I feel about it. And me, I'm going to put myself into that list too, right? Like, I'm not going to stop podcasting, no matter what happens here with the giant companies. And if they don't have room for me, I'll use those independent venues. I mean, that's just the way that I feel about it. And I'm not worried. I'm just not concerned. I'm just not. I think this is all going to work out okay. I do think, though, that it is great for that certain segment. I've got a buddy who I have helped. He was a younger guy, a friend of mine from college, worked with this kid when she was a grad student and he was an undergrad. Said, "Hey, I'd like to introduce you." He's getting into radio drama and stuff, and I helped him learn the ropes a little bit, and he's far advanced me as far as narrative podcasting goes now. He's already got a gig with Amazon. He's made one project with them, I know, for their Audible stuff. Like, I see this and go, "Oh, this is perfect for him." This is perfect for him. I can't wait for those opportunities that are going to come, the extra checks that are going to come his way, and others like him, other people that I know in that field. For me, does this mean any money? Probably not. I can't really see Apple buying this show or another show that I do realistically, but I think I'm not worried that it's going to hurt the ecosystem, I guess, is my broader point, Jay. I'm just not. Now why don't we move to the other thing that Apple did? Or is doing this week, rather. Their podcasting category changes have gone into effect this week, at least with Libsyn's back in. If you use Libsyn as your media host, you can go and make those changes now for your categories. I have not done it for my clients, but I'm set up to do it this week. And I don't know how quickly that's rolling out to other media hosts. This article comes from Blueberry, so I'm assuming that they are probably on top of it and have rolled out the changes this week too. Changes 2019 Apple Podcast category changes affect nearly 75% of podcast shows. Is your podcast affected by the change? Take advantage of this opportunity. If your show can take advantage of the new categories, update your categories immediately. This change is an opportunity for your show to be one of the first in these new categories. If you are a Blueberry.com hosting customer, please go to the podcaster dashboard, click the podcast settings, etc., etc. Jay, why is it such an opportunity to make this change? Why is Todd so excited about this possibility? I had not thought about it in this way until this article.
Well, it was Angelo who sort of did the math on this over at Blueberry, and this is the key line. It's all the way at the end of the article. I wish they had led with this. These new categories and subcategories will now have their own top 200 shows featured within them, which will give over 13,000 podcasts top 200 exposure in the Apple Podcasts directory. Now, we're talking about that ecosphere and the independent podcaster. That's a huge number. I can tell you 13,000 podcasts doesn't account for the top 1%. You know, when you listen to Rob Walsh give out the numbers of what the median mean is, and 1% is, you know, podcasts over, I think it's over 30,000 downloads per episode or something like that. I could be wrong.
That sounds about right.
But it's close.
I think it's higher than that. But it's in that range anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. It's close at the very least. So 13,000, that's great. We talk about the discovery problem in podcasting. I hold that there isn't a discovery problem. There's a discovery of your podcast problem. This would go towards helping your podcast problem, your podcast discovery problem, being in another individual top 200. Now, that said, we'll see exactly how much this sort of weeds out the chaff, so to speak. Or was I supposed to say that the other way around? Man, I am all over the place today.
Separating the wheat from the chaff, I think. I got you. I knew what you meant.
We've also talked about the fact there are a lot of quote-unquote dead shows in Apple. Some of those shows may end up showing up in these top 200s. If this many podcasts are going to end up being featured, there's a good chance that there's going to be shows that are dormant.
Category.
Okay, that's a good point too. So
if you're dormant, if you're truly dormant, you're not going to go in and change the category probably in your back end, which means that you might be lost in the shuffle. I think that's maybe one of their hopes. One of Apple's hopes is like, we'll have a bunch of shows that will effectively fall out of the categories because they won't relist properly. That's interesting. So you need to look into that. If you are an independent producer and you're working on your show yourself, particularly if you have clients, you need to start looking this week at making those changes in the back end of your media host, and take advantage of that as quickly as possible. Now, it's my understanding though, Jay, these won't actually work for the results. They won't show up in Apple's app until the fall, right? And now they might for me because I'm running betas on my iOS devices, but for most of us, these won't show up until we get iOS 13, in September.
Part I don't know. I leave that sort of stuff up to you.
I will verify that this week and let you know that whether or not that's true next week. But I believe that it is the case. You will only actually see these changes take effect if you're using iOS 13 or I suppose Mac OS Catalina, which is the next version of Mac, which includes the Apple Podcasts app. But that one will actually be later even than iOS 13. Generally, the iOS app, the iOS update comes out the same time as the new iPhones. So the the first or second week of September, and then the Mac update comes in October. Generally, they'll have a second event a lot of times with like iPad releases and that sort of thing. Anyway, interesting. And honestly, Jay, I mean, we've talked about the category changes before. We haven't talked about the fact that they've actually been implemented now. You can take advantage of them in most media hosts, but also we hadn't looked at it from this sort of an opportunity, to sort of reshuffle things. And that is a problem for a lot of people. It's a problem that a lot of people have been complaining about a long time. Take advantage of this new sort of gold rush, I suppose. Your boyfriend's back.
Yeah, he is. And he's going to cause some trouble. Hey now. Tom Webster. Well, first we should start with the New York Times did a piece about the death of podcasting. Have we arrived at peak podcasting, and is it dying already? Which many of us, of course, laugh at. Sort of, clearly it's another one of those clickbaity type articles that the writer didn't do his research and didn't talk to enough people. And Nick Quall writes about it in the latest Hot Pod. Tom Webster had an article a couple days ago about, no, we haven't reached the death of podcasting, but what will kill podcasting is this. And actually, he starts with what won't kill podcasting. And there's some interesting insights, as always, from the Wise Webby when it comes to talking about the business of podcasting. Starting with, no one has right to an audience. I'm going to pause for dramatic effect and repeat that again. No one has a right to an audience. Though your cause be just and your hearts be pure, you don't get handed an audience. You don't deserve one, not one single pair of earballs. And thus, podcasting simply becomes like every other medium known to humankind. No blogger has the right to an audience either. Wilkie Collins out-Dickinsoned Charles Dickens and wrote the first detective story before Poe, but we read Dickens and Poe today, not Collins. Dickens had his own magazine. Pause for dramatic effect. Go figure. So again, it's not that just because you make a great podcast, it could sound phenomenal. It could have the 3 E's that I talk about all the time. It could be the most wonderful podcast that nobody's ever heard. And it still won't get that audience because you haven't done any marketing. You haven't forged any sort of relationships with your community. You haven't tried to build a community around it. You haven't tried to do any sort of marketing for it whatsoever. Just because you make it, they will not come. The Field of Dreams, that doesn't happen. You don't build it and then they come. Nope. You got to do a lot more than that. So be aware that, that's not a cause of the death of podcasting. Tom goes on to another point about what won't kill podcasting. The atomic unit of the podcast is not RSS. It's the show. Alex Carter pointed out on Twitter that it's actually the episode, which is fair. And anyway, it's never been up to the creators. It's always up to the audience. If I put my show on Spotify, it may no longer be a podcast by definition. But what do you think the average Spotify listener will call it? We've done a pretty good job normalizing what is pretty wonky technical term, podcast. Why screw this up now? And he makes a great point there. Because we always talk about, well, this is technically streaming, and streaming isn't even technically streaming. It's progressively downloading, and if it doesn't get fed on an RSS feed and it's not an Apple, then you can't call it a podcast. And that point is the one that I wanted to highlight there. Even if it's just a show on Spotify, even if it's just a show on Pandora, it's still going to be called a podcast by the audience. So this goes back to the whole, podcast is such a stupid term, let's call this something different. And I guess, in a way, maybe that is the death of podcast as a term. Maybe it is time that we just start calling it on-demand audio or something even more generic to cite specifically what it is that people are listening to. But ultimately, the audience that's listening on Spotify sees it's listed as a podcast. They're going to call it a podcast, even though it may technically not be a podcast.
I mean, I guess chalk me up like the Kleenex executive, early in the genericization of that word. I don't want this. I don't want podcast to just mean audio show. like, we do have a word for that. It's called a show. You can have a show that's not a podcast. You can have a show that's a YouTube show. You can have a show that's a web show. You can have a show that's a Amazon show. You can have a show that's a TV show. Podcast means something. I disagree with Tom here. I think I understand his argument, and he may be right in the end. Right? That's what happened with Kleenex. Enough people used it enough, and now anything that you wipe your nose with is a Kleenex. I get that. And that may happen with podcasting. I don't think we're quite there yet still, so I'm going to keep saying get off my lawn for a little while longer. For a little while longer.
Now, this is where I sort of disagree with Tom, and this is sort of what he says will kill podcasting. He says, put yourself in the shoes of a media buyer. You've got to buy from a leading national advertiser. And on the one hand, you've got a podcast network offering something risky. Host-read content or something bespoke to the show at, say, a $25 CPM. Or another network, which is offering reach across all their shows using your existing audio and radio creative for a mere $5 CPM. What is the safe bet for your media buying career, Joel? Which one are you most likely going to buy?
Having worked with many ad agencies during my time in radio before, it's the $5 CPM with the ad that you've already made, you've already had approved by HR, you've already had approved by the CEO, you've already paid the talent, etc., etc., etc.
And it's going to be distributed on all your shows, not just one.
Yeah.
It's going to be distributed across many shows.
I'm going to call them out specifically because I worked with them specifically. Raising Cane's, the chicken franchise, I worked with their ad agency it's not the same agency that they use anymore, I don't believe, but I worked with their agency for several years. And I know they're not interested in a host-read ad because they don't know your host and they don't have time to learn about your host or what their particular peccadillos are or the weird things that they might potentially say, on the air that they would be upset about, etc., etc. They don't want to know about the in-jokes in your audience. They don't have time or interest. If you're offering the $5 thing, they're going to buy it. Now, Tom says, so we're going to get a flood of Burger King commercials and it's going to ruin podcasting.
Well, great content is expensive to produce. Great advertising native to that content's form and delivery is well worth the premium. But if several large players in the space start taking poorly executed, irrelevant ads at ultra low for podcasting CPMs, that's going to have repercussions on the economic feasibility of great audio content. And where I disagree with him is Audio Boom and Acast just reported their record growth in revenues this past week. And guess what type of ads they generally feature on a majority of their podcasts? Those quote-unquote cheap ads. And what have we said here? We've got those quote-unquote cheap ads on this podcast. It's this little bubble that exists in podcasting. And I get it. Listen, I'm not going to sit here and say I'm a lover of those cheap ads. But what I am going to say is those cheap ads are the only way I, as a smaller podcaster, am going to make money from ads. That's it. Period. We had this conversation last week. Unless I have a super targeted niche market, I'm not getting that $25 CPM no matter what. And you just mentioned it too. You were working with a company that they don't have the time to go and learn who all these hosts are and build a relationship with all of these hosts. It doesn't work. There is a company out there called A Million Ads that is trying to scale high quality produced major branded advertising that can be dynamic and can be fed to multiple different markets. But even when talking with them, they don't want to be in the creative space. So now you need to hire that person to be the creative, to go along with the tech, to go along with the producer, to go along with the talent. All of that's going to cost money. Here's the thing that podcasters don't seem to understand. We're still early as a medium. These $25 CPMs are fantastic. They're better than what radio's getting, and that's why radio is so attracted to podcasting right now. They go, $25 CPM? Holy mackerel, let me get in on some of that. We can't get that on our radio shows. And you're going to find that as you make higher revenues, your expenses are going to start increasing. It's just a simple matter of fact. There's no way you're going to be able to maintain the low expense, high revenues. It's just not going to continue. And while I agree with him that these companies that are out there that are buying the $5 CPM ads will ultimately lower the cost on all the ads altogether, because that's also just the nature of business, and that's just the way it's going to end up working. It's not going to kill podcasting. It's going to kill the high revenues that we're seeing. You're just not going to see a guy who's only got an audience of 20,000 people worldwide, by the way. Think of that. Think about this. It's fun. This is something that I always find interesting. When shows say, I don't have an audience, nobody's listening to me, and people ask, well, how many listeners do you have? Oh, I have about 200. And then they say, well, think about if those 200 people were in one room, how exciting would that be? But they're not all in one room. They're spread across the world, and the world is getting to be a smaller place, but ultimately you're still talking about the world. And you take 20,000 people and you spread them across the world, and they're not as exciting as 20,000 people in one location. And so that's sort of a lot of what I'm trying to get at there, is that even if you have a larger audience, if you're considered one of the 1%ers, as we've discussed, your audience is still scattered across the globe. So ultimately, the impact of that audience for an advertiser isn't going to hit, even if it's a national branded advertiser. Think about what's the percentage of your audience in the United States? I've seen, depending on what kind of podcast you are, I know from my own podcast, it's like 80%. 20% of my audience, and I've got a small audience, is outside of the United States listening to American football talk. So
I would imagine most podcasts are probably higher than that percentage as far as internationally, since yours is based around an American sport as well.
Yeah, so
if I was about a TV show, it would probably be much broader internationally. Our show, for instance, about podcasting is fairly international. I think we have like a 65% American audience versus international reach, and the international is largely concentrated in a few places. All English-speaking countries, primarily, of course, and Germany. We have a fairly big listenership in Germany because Germany is a big podcasting country. Has been for a long time.
But those audience mean nothing to... I'm trying to
advertisers.
Well, certain advertisers.
Like Geico.
Right. Geico doesn't sell insurance in those countries. Perfect example.
No. Yeah.
So,
or Burger King. Burger King does not have the penetration into most of those countries that it does in America, for instance. And their advertising, I imagine, is greatly different, even in the countries where they do have market reach. So, I use Geico and Burger King as examples all the time because they are big companies that do buy podcast advertising. I mean, I've heard those ads. Speaking of dynamic advertising, let me just tell you where I sit on this, Jay, because this is my particular thing. If I were a hobbyist podcaster with a single interest, okay, if I had just this show, I probably would host this show on a media host that does not use dynamic insertion and probably wouldn't have dynamically inserted advertising anyway in the middle of it. However, I don't just do one show, right? I've got 5 podcasts that occasionally get episodes produced, and those are in various stages of production on any ongoing basis, but I don't want any of them to go away. I don't want any of them to be delisted at any time, and I do want to continue to produce content for all of them at some point in the future. And because of that, I would need a monthly cost for every single one of those podcasts. And the first one is easily justifiable. Dave Jackson's right. Especially if you're not producing content, all you got to pay is $5 a month to Libsyn to keep that account active, right? That's absolutely true. $5 a month is pretty easy. $60 a year, almost anybody can come up with that if you've got a hobby or a passion. However, how many people could come up with 60 times 5 every year? And again, just for hobby, just for fun, just for my passion. that becomes harder to justify all of a sudden. It's a little easier for me, maybe, or you than normal people, because you and I work in the podcast industry. And so this is our business, our bread and butter. Our hobby becomes part of our day job, et cetera, et cetera. There's some crossover there. But still, I could not go to my wife and justify $300 plus worth of annual expenses for hosting a show. That's not a thing that can happen. So dynamic ad insertion allows me to keep doing all of those shows that I want to do without having to come out of my pocket for every single one of them. That's the difference. And I think many, many podcasters, once they get into it and they get going, they will find they also have multiple interests, or just side things that they want to pursue. I talk all the time about doing family projects, about doing genealogy stories, about talking to your grandparents, recording those family histories. Even if you only ever really put that up for your family, again, you have to host it somewhere. That's an expense. Dynamic ad insertion can make that more sustainable and less of a burden on you as an individual. I think there is a place for that. It's not for everybody. I'm not saying every podcaster needs to go to it. But when you get to your fifth or sixth show, sometimes those little expenses add up, Jay.
Well, and the point is, when we're talking about dynamic ad insertion, by the way, as well, that's the tech that is delivering the ads. It doesn't necessarily refer to the ads. You can have high-priced ads in dynamic and utilize dynamic ad insertion as well. So you can have a host-read ad that's dynamically ad inserted into your show. It just refers to the technology. It's the difference between the type of ads that you're taking on your show. And here's the thing. In Tom's article, he even mentions this. There's research that shows that even the cheap ads, as I'll just call them for ease of phrase, they don't turn off your audience as much as you think they do. Again, it's this little podcasting bubble. We live in this podcasting bubble. We got into podcasting because we were like, oh my God, the number of ads that are on terrestrial radio are egregious. And it is. It's absolutely egregious. But remember, the business model of radio is not that of podcasting, and you don't need to replicate that business model either. But you can take things from what they're doing and utilize it to your best advantage as a podcaster, and understand that, no, this loud ad for Geico, this ad that's way off, and we can make the technology better, by the way. There's no reason why an ad has to come in blaring out of nowhere that doesn't match with the audio of your podcast. There are levelators out there that can work quite easily for everybody. So I don't understand. You can set the standards, and standards have been, I don't know if they've actually been set per se. It goes back to this whole trade association thing. Wouldn't it be great if there was a trade association where we set sort of a standard? This is going to be the loofahs that we're going to have every piece of audio delivered to, no matter where it is, no matter where it's produced, no matter what company is hosting all of this stuff. Wouldn't that be fantastic? I mean,
that would be really nice. That would be really nice. I would especially appreciate it being a choice and a decision by podcasters, as opposed to just doing whatever, the largest new entrants to the space say. For instance, everybody changed their LUFs recently because Spotify and Amazon both wanted louder than what Apple had previously asked for. I did too. In fact, our LUFs now match the Spotify suggestion. Anyway, I don't know. I don't know a way around this, Jay. I do know that I don't like what Blueberry is doing with it. Blueberry has announced they are charging for their dynamic advertising.
Why? I don't understand it. I mean, unless they're charging people to utilize the technology for their own ads, that to me, I can see that there needs to be a fee. But even then, like if you just create it, that you have to be at a certain tier on Blueberry, and then you have to pay the fee for the dynamic ad insertion. So you're charging the customer twice to even utilize the system. Like, I don't understand. I hear Todd talk about this all the time, how expensive it is for this to work. Well, why are there other companies that aren't charging for this sort of thing? That's what I don't understand. And by the way, those other companies that aren't charging for it, I've seen that they're starting to sniff around, and they might actually start charging for it, which is disturbing to me as well. It's like, oh, well, you're telling me that people are willing to actually pay for this? I mean, there's a revenue share, too. That's the other I don't know if that's discussed in this, if there's any sort of rev share with these ads. Again, I have a feeling that this is just in that the charge for the use of it is for ads that you are putting, that you have acquired yourself, and now you want to use the tech to actually traffic those particular ads. But even that, I still don't think that it's a necessary charge.
No, I'm with you on both parts of that. I think it is exactly what you just described. This is set up more for, like the company we talked about a couple of weeks ago, where they're like, hey, you can create promos to put in your show dynamically or advertisements directly. That's what this is. This is not a partnership where we're going to go out and find advertising and insert into your show and share the revenue with you, which is what Audio Boom, Spreaker with their Prime program, others are doing.
Acast.
Acast, exactly. I don't know. I feel like that is, well, Anchor, right? I mean, that's what Anchor is doing as well. That's what Anchor is doing. So I don't know. I think there is a way to go forward on this, and I don't think Blueberry has it right. That's my opinion. Jay, what else? What else do we have today? Last week's Hot Pod?
Yeah, so this was the story that we missed last week when we recorded early, and that was about Stitcher. Nick noticed that Stitcher appears to be in the process of changing their platform vendors, where they had been using Midroll for hosting services. Midroll, of course, is the company's sales division at Stitcher. And their preferred platform had been Art19, and now they appear to be switching to Omni, which was the hosting platform that Triton Digital acquired in June. Scripps is Stitcher's parent company, which acquired Triton Digital last December. So all of this is going towards this weird, we're your parent and you are our child and we're going to be one big happy family. But also don't forget that 2 members of the Stitcher Midroll team went to Art19 a few months ago. Triton Omni used to be all of the big broadcast, is used by all of the big broadcast radio people out there. Most of the big broadcasting companies that are getting into podcasting are all using Omni for this, and they know Triton, and it's just starting to become, you can start to see that there's an ecosystem being developed for the big broadcasters that doesn't necessarily include the little guys anymore. And this is, again, one of the things that I would look at with a very close eye as more and more of these companies start forming relationships. And you got to just understand the relationships that are occurring here and why they're occurring and why you can't be part of that group because you're not a big radio broadcaster.
Yeah, this is interesting, but not surprising. When Triton was purchased, you had to assume that they would eventually either fold their media tools or be used by their corporate overlords. It was going to be one or the other. So now they're using their ad serving technology. Makes sense. Triton is a company that I worked with in radio years back. They did a lot of things, some of them well, some of them very well, some of them not so well. But I think that they have been sort of streamlined and repurposed over the past few years. I think this is actually going to be pretty good for them. It will be interesting to see whether they start pitching this technology to the other large companies. I look at people like, the PRX group in the past that have sort of done their own thing and gone their own way. Will they just partner with a big company like this? Makes sense. Might be a lot of efficiencies on both sides. And then also, will they start using some of those big public radio companies maybe for the creative side of this, for instance? Are there potentially some partnerships there to be created? And then honestly, you get something like that and you could have the kind of behemoth that could lock down effectively all of the professional level podcast advertising pretty quickly. By
the way, all of this just continues to blow my mind. But another sort of idea behind all these radio broadcasters creating their own ecosphere in radio, in podcasting. And it goes towards the fact that, remember, Joel, radio, and you're from radio, is expensive. It's a lot to have a tower that broadcasts 5,000 watts or whatever it's broadcasting, and to upkeep those studios and upkeep that. Podcasting is very, very cheap in relation to that. Distributing over the internet is a lot cheaper than it is via broadcast, and as more cars become more digitally compatible, and as it becomes even more easy to get everything delivered to you digitally, these radio stations are going to have to find a new way to distribute their content, and they're starting to form all these relationships. And now Nielsen is another one that's been trying to get in on this. Yes, the same company that gives you your TV ratings, they're also involved in radio, and they now want to be heavily involved in podcasting. We've seen some reports from Nielsen about buyer habits regarding certain audiences and what sort of things that they buy depending on the type of podcast that they listen to. And now they're expanding that type of research even further. They've formed a partnership with 5 other companies. One of them, by the way, does happen to be Stitcher, iHeartMedia, Cadence 13, Westwood One, and Cabana, all getting in on getting some of this information that will help them provide even more information to potential brand advertisers to work more towards that direct response type ads, which bring those higher CPMs and blah, 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 blah. You can see, but they're all working together. There are other companies that do this that aren't already involved in radio, the Midroll being one of them, although Stitcher is part of Midroll and they're also buying in on this. It's just one of those things. And as to even expand upon this, there's been a couple of new hires here recently in the podcasting space. Crooked Media, they have tapped former Netflix executive Sarah Geismer for their creative development post, and American Public Media has hired Liliana Kim, who was formerly the vice president of MTV International Content Strategy and Brand Management, as their new managing director of podcasts. This isn't bad for the space, but it's also people that have never been involved in podcasting. So the pro is they're going to hopefully bring some fresh ideas, some fresh set of eyes, some fresh set of earballs to help develop new types of content in the podcasting space. The con is that they haven't been involved in the podcasting space at all, if at all. And they're going to just make the same mistakes that have been made 15 years ago that don't need to be made again.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, it's exciting to know that, a couple of executives, people that were fairly high ranking in the quote unquote traditional media world, would be interested in making the move to podcasting, right? In both of these cases, this seems to me to show the maturity and the maturation of our industry. That's great news. But yeah, neither one of these people have backgrounds. Neither one of these ladies has backgrounds in audio. That concerns me. I mean, they both have backgrounds in media agencies that know good storytelling.
Sure.
Right? Mm-hmm. Which would recommend them. And so I'll give them that as a benefit of the doubt, I suppose. But at the same time, the audio world is a different space entirely. And I am a little concerned that at least off the top, neither one of these have any radio background or again, audio experience. I start seeing this happening more and more, is this little closed off ecosphere of the big broadcaster in podcasting and the independent podcaster. And the divisions are becoming clearer and clearer, and hopefully, something like Podcast Movement, which I know is happening in a couple of weeks, can help blend that some more. The problem is I still see it's still sort of separated. It's too separated. Somehow we need to find a way to blend it together, because I've always said the big podcaster can learn from the little podcaster and vice versa. There are things that both sides do very well, and there are things that both sides do very poorly that the other side does better. And it's really the mix of the two where you're going to find
the best result. And I just don't see that happening. I just see more closed walls. The walls continue to grow, and they're getting higher and higher and higher. On that note,
Jay, yeah, I was going to say, why don't we break down some walls and maybe give an example of a great podcast that you've been listening to this week?
So I mentioned that I did that series for the Barrett Sports Media Group, the 5 podcasts in 5 days. And one of my biggest takeaways from listening to those 5 podcasts is that sports podcasts lack innovation. It seems that everybody's doing the same thing. We're taking 2 people or multiple people, we're putting them in front of a microphone, they're going to give their hot takes, and boom, we're gone. I was most disappointed in those 5 podcasts I listened to, and you can go to barrettsportsmedia.com and read my reviews. In the Real_Sports podcast, which was a podcast that's working with the Blue Wire Group, working with these Instagram stars who have ginormous audiences on Instagram and thus have a very large built-in audience. And now they're starting to do podcasts. But what they've done is they've taken these young guys who have no radio experience and they're copying what everybody else is doing instead of actually innovating the space and doing something different. And that was the one that disappointed me the most, because I was hoping to hear some innovation, but instead I heard 2 guys reading other people's stuff and sort of making a podcast out of it. That led to Jason Bryant, who produces wrestling podcasts, has the Mat Men Podcast Network. He said, I've been dabbling in narrative for the first time, and I've produced this show called Rocked Up. Would you mind giving it a listen? And because I was in that space and I didn't have any other podcasts ready to queue up, I was like, let's download it and listen to it. And ultimately, what I told Jason, and I told him I was going to say this on the podcast, is that my issue with niche sports in wrestling, this is not the squared ring with ropes and Vince McMahon and Hulk Hogan
wrestling,
and stuff.
collegiate wrestling.
This is exactly that type of wrestling.
Greco-Roman.
Exactly. All that stuff. Not the I'm going to tell you something, brother.
Oh yeah.
Off the top rope. Oh my God, that's Vince McMahon's music.
There are no foreign objects.
No.
There are no foreign objects in this wrestling.
No. It's nothing like that. Is you have to get the person who's not in your niche sport excited about listening to this show. And it's very well produced and it's a good story, but it makes assumptions that you already know about wrestling, except he didn't want to make those assumptions, because there's a couple of times in the storytelling that he says, well, if you don't know who this person is, let me tell you exactly. And he gives a brief history of why this particular person is important in the story of Rocked Up. Except he also didn't start episode 1 with what Rocked Up is all about. He started it with episode 0, which is his trailer episode, which I, by the way, skipped. I didn't listen to the trailer episode. I started with episode 1. I didn't need to hear the trailer. I wanted to listen to the podcast. I wanted to get right into the storytelling, but I missed a key important part, which he has in the trailer. And I reminded him that you kind of have to have that in every episode, not just episode 1, but also episode 2 and episode 3. And especially because he's producing it on a monthly schedule, you have to understand that while you are producing this story and it seems very fresh to you, that person listened to part 1 of your story a month ago, and now they're listening to part 2 of your story a month later. You kind of have to remind them, what they were listening to in part 1. Plus, there's going to be those weird people that will start with episode 3, and they'll decide if they want to give the whole story a shot and go back to episode 1. It's just one of those weird things that occurs. But ultimately, it's very well produced. It's very well researched. I liked it for the most part, but it's a little too focused on those people that are interested in wrestling, and that's the only sort of caveat that I gave to him.
That makes total sense. Really interesting topic. I love the tagline, "Wrestling is the world's oldest sport. In Arkansas, it's the newest." Very, very interesting idea. I had no idea what Rocked Up was about. It's the University of Arkansas at Little Rock is the university that is being referenced here. So the Little Rock Trojans, they're rocked up. All right, that makes sense. So here's my show that I've been listening to this week, Jay, and I've actually been listening to it for a couple weeks now. I have begun watching the FX TV show Legion, which is based on the X-Men comics, of course. Legion in the comics is David Haller, the son of Professor X, Charles Xavier. He's one of, if not the most powerful mutant in the world. He also, in the comics, has... I don't believe this is the term for it anymore, but we used to call it multiple personality disorder. He's schizophrenic. And because of that, each one of his personalities has its own mutant power. So in the comics, often he's sort of limited because he can't control everything. But on occasions, he'll bring it all together and can be kind of a world-destroying monster if he wants to be. The TV series is just fascinating. It's from Noah Hawley, who's the same creator who made Fargo, the TV version of Fargo, which I was very skeptical of, but the critics have all raved about. I haven't started watching it yet, but I've heard really good things. Legion is now in its third season on FX. This is going to be the final one. And this season, it's a slight spoiler, but it was what got me interested in the show finally. Season 3 has introduced Charles Xavier into the storyline. So he is actually Charles's son, and we see that play out, or we're going to see that play out over the course of this season. The two of them actually sort of meeting, perhaps even. So it's very, very exciting. The show is a total mind trip. It includes musical dance numbers, like full-on Bollywood musical productions, as well as these insane special effects jaunts. There are actual battles between, psychic-powered superheroes and villains. It's really, really cool. I cannot suggest it enough. It is an adult show. It's TVMA, but it is very, very interesting. And this podcast that I've been listening to about it, I love even more. The podcast is called Inside Legion. It's from comicbookclublive.com. They do a weekly live show, apparently, where they live stream and have some people in front of them even, and they talk about comic books and comic book shows. And then they have specific podcasts on individual TV shows. Inside Legion is one of them. The thing that I like so much about this podcast is that it is incredibly short. They do not recap the episodes, really, which is something that I know post-show podcasts, some really like the recap, some really don't like it at all. This show doesn't do that. They will skirt, a brief description of what happened, and then let's get into our discussion, and then let's get out. The episodes are generally under 30 minutes, which while the TV episodes are, 42 minutes plus ads or whatever, to be able to get the podcast in less than the TV show, if you listen to many post-show podcasts, that
doesn't happen.
No, most
they're usually double.
Yeah, exactly. Like if the show's an hour long, then the podcast is 2 hours long. Exactly. So I really appreciate that about it, and I was able to, as I binged through the TV show itself, I was able to also binge the podcast without slowing me down, since the podcast episodes were so brief. They do give you that fan discussion that you want, though. I mean, that's what a post-show podcast is about. It's like, I have this thing in my head now. I want to hear and talk to other people about it. My wife didn't watch it. My best friend didn't watch it or isn't caught up with me. Who do I talk to? Oh, it's this podcast. That's where I get my fix, Inside Legion. I cannot suggest it enough. It is a very, very cool show. Very enjoyable, just as much as the podcast. Cannot suggest the TV show enough. It's one of the best TV shows on TV right now, I think. And because it's on FX, I think it's going under people's radar. I think it's one of those things that people are going to find in a year or two on Hulu or Netflix or whatever, and then it's going to blow up.
I watched season 1 of Legion and didn't get into it. I couldn't get into it. But then again, is because of that TVMA that I had to watch it late at night. So oftentimes I'd find myself falling asleep, and it was just a little too much to try and get into at 10 p.m. in the evening when your brain is shutting down. You really need to have your brain active to watch that show, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Otherwise, I mean, it's going to. You might have nightmares if you're not fully turned on. The other thing is, we have this show. I think well, how should I say this? I love what they've done with mutants. I feel, as a comic book fan, let down in a lot of ways by the X-Men film franchise. I'm very excited about what Marvel's going to do now that they have access to all of the X-Men and those side characters. But this is an example of, and it's absolutely an adaptation. It is not super faithful to what the comic version of Legion was. But it gets the tone. It gets the feeling of that mutant otherness that comes from the comics, like the idea of them being like really set apart and persecuted, but also powerful. All of those things at the same time. This show nails it, man. And again, as they've gone on in the second and third seasons, they go a lot of really interesting places. I cannot recommend it enough. And the first 2 seasons are on Hulu, so if you've got access to Hulu, you can binge them there. And then the third season is available on FX now. If you're a cable subscriber, that's how I'm watching it. I'm streaming it through the FX app.
Nice.
All right, Jay, that is it for this week. We'll have more podcast news and more podcast suggestions for you next week on Always Listening. Until then, tell everybody how they can get in touch with you.
At The Real Podvader on Twitter, facebook.com/Podvader page, and nextfanup@gmail.com if you want to email me. But Jason DM'd me on Twitter, so that's it's probably one of the easier ways to get in touch with me. At The Real Podvader.
You can find me on Twitter at The Rogues Life or anywhere else, propodcastingservices.com. That's my website, and all of my info and links are there. All right, until next week, we've been your hosts. I'm Joel.
I'm Jay, and I think the 2019 concept of The Lion King is better, but I still prefer the 1994 Lion King.
Here's one for your noodle. Is the 2019 film a live-action movie or not?
It's a good... Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough.
Always Listening is a proud member of the Two Guys and a Rogue Network. You can find all of our past episodes, including more than 100 podcast reviews, at alwayslisteningpod.com, in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher Radio, or anywhere you listen to podcasts. For help on your podcast, visit propodcastingservices.com. Our theme song is Enough from Bethany Rayburn.
When that day comes and I stop breathing, will you bury me with my love? Will you bury me with my love? 'Cause if I never thought twice about dying, then this ain't no life at all. Honey, it ain't no life at all. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've seen enough. Yeah, I know I ain't seen it all, but I've had enough.
Two guys and a rogue.
I'm one guy,
I'm the other.
and this is the network.